let's say I had grandkids and they would ask like, oh yeah, what was the most popular thing when you were young? I reckon I would be hard pressed to ignore the pervasive existence and influence of video games. Although video games are often associated with a stereotypical subculture of geeks, outsiders, and people who sort of look like they're hooked up to the Matrix, somewhere down the line video games surged in popularity and went mainstream, and now everyone plays them for 18 hours a day, even babies and Malcolm Turnbull. And while that is a lie, the undeniable mass appeal of video games has fundamentally infected things like popular culture and technological development. Their popularity is facilitated by the kind of technological world we live in, where ubiquity has pretty much shaped how we interact with the world and our relationship with things like the environment, society, economics, and healthcare. We're sort of at the point now where our reliance upon technology pretty much means we have to maintain innovation and consumption as driving forces to push societal development.
Rapid consumption and constant innovation has accelerated integration to the point where I reckon I'm one Android update away from having my corporeal form uploaded to the cloud. I mean, at least I wouldn't need a calorie count.
Now, there isn't to say technology is detrimental to society. In fact, to say so ignores the benefits and leaps made possible by integration. But like anything else that becomes so integral to the basic functioning of a system, i.e. human society, reviewing how best to utilize and apply technology allows for systemic analysis to improve efficient and effective use. One important subsystem that requires integration improvement is education. In a world where human capital is shifting towards 21st century skills like innovation and creativity, education systems actively seeking methods of fostering transferable skill sets are looking towards technological support tools to facilitate student development in the new economy. Although most education systems practice integration, their effectiveness varies according to factors like culture, resource, and support. And although most educational authorities have acknowledged the need to foster 21st century skills as shown through things like digital literacy and ICT capability standards, some systems have trouble transitioning and utilizing new technology as a result of conflict between old and new methodological frameworks. This is an issue not only because it creates systemic inefficiencies and inconsistencies, but a precedence for technological misuse and conservatism. Video games in education systems are a prominent example of this, because despite their relatively lengthy existence in education and their undeniable popularity as an interactive medium, the track record for its utilization as a tool for student improvement has been mediocre at best. As we'll see, they have the ability to engage and motivate people to play, but education systems that attempt to integrate the medium seem to have missed what makes games unique. So despite what could be lightly considered lackluster history, the current state of integration is better, but not so great as to prevent me from still being disappointed. In promoting the use of video games as a viable educational tool, we need to look at where the deficiencies are in the integration process and find ways to improve upon it.
This'll be fun.
The utilization of games to learn has always been a core educational concept. Promoted by figures like Vygotsky and Piaget, who both emphasize the capacity of play to foster cognitive development, games are an extension of the experience gathering process. Video games in education have largely been characterized by the precedents set by edutainment games, which are essentially an amalgamation of entertainment and education, and broadly refers to games where the content and mechanics are designed to educate in an entertaining way.
If you went to school in the 90s or even the early 2000s and you had access to a computer, you've probably seen games like this before. Titles like Carmen Sandiego, Rita Rabbit, Math Blaster, the Magic School Bus series, or even Oregon Trail are some of the more well-known examples of this.
As kind of the first attempt at educational game integration, titles like these were utilized partly in response to the meteoric rise of commercial video games like Pac-Man during the 1980s. Interesting, cost-effective educational tools that could not only lighten the burden of instruction, but also engage students within an interactive environment was, and is still to some degree, an educational dream. And so right up until around the early 2000s, the popularity of edutainment games was largely characterized by its alignment with more traditional and didactic forms of instruction. We'll call this Phase 1 for clarity. The issue with edutainment games lies in their tendency to rely on behaviorism to push the gameplay loop, and typically involve mechanics that rely on repetition, factual recall, and rote learning within a framework of extrinsic reward. The problem with drill and practice is that it doesn't really have any effective transference value, since what you're essentially doing with these games is training for repeated mechanical operation rather than building actual understanding. The other problem is that in an attempt to balance fun and learning, edutainment titles have to disguise the educational content in the skin of something entertaining. But because there isn't really a metric for this, what ends up happening a lot of the time is that either the learning overshadows the fun to the point where it loses appeal, or the fun overshadows the learning to the point of the education component losing its value. This is compounded by edutainment being a generally low quality product, especially in terms of graphics, gameplay, and technology due to lower budgets compared to commercial games.
I mean, look at this, I'm pretty sure Donkey Kong came out in the same year.
And although this isn't necessarily the fault of developers, it means that the range of topics that can be covered in a game is limited, and we saw this in how a lot of games focus on spelling or mathematics because these are easily programmable within the budget. The biggest implementation problem with Phase 1, however, was over-reliance on and the misuse of the actual game. The mantra of implementation that has endured even today can best be described succinctly as play this game and hopefully you'll learn something. This top-down approach created a warped perception of games that was compounded by excessive educational optimism towards a product's non-existent ability to fill the role of the teacher. And so video games have pretty much ceased to exist in most education systems, due largely to the precedents set by the failure of Phase 1. And even when they are implemented, their utilization is characterized by a form of technological conservatism.
An example of this is Mathletics in the Australian system, where although it has benefits, it's about as fun as a slip disc, which makes it a not great example of successful implementation.
Despite the relatively disappointing history of video games in education systems, researchers nonetheless continue to note the positive benefits that can be generated from video games, and therefore makes them still worth pursuing in an educational setting. Video games as an interactive medium have the ability to facilitate the creation of effective educational meaning through agentic play. This concept of creating educational meaning through gameplay has become the prime focus of game-based learning research, and it's not particularly difficult to see why if you understand what makes video games so engaging. The appeal of commercial entertainment video games comes not simply from their ability to be fun, but seemingly more from their versatility as an interactive medium that can be used to facilitate an agentic experience. Aside from the technical ability of games and their seemingly endless capacity to design imaginative worlds or self-contained narratives, video games can offer the opportunity to create experiences that fulfill basic human needs like confidence and autonomy. The act of play generates agency through gameplay control, which has been shown to improve intrinsic motivation and engagement by allowing a player to attribute personal meaning to an experience. Game-based learning frameworks attempt to harness agency in meaningful play and typically tend to focus on reconstituting the entertainment aspect of video games into an educational setting. Games like Minecraft are a good example of where commercial games have had their educational value cannibalized to meet educational necessities, as you can use the game as a simulation to facilitate teaching of things like spatial reasoning or project creation. This concept of game versatility in an educational setting can be seen in some titles offering the ability to track metric data, which can be used to inform progression, while the replayability of other games allows for trial and error and risk-taking to occur without the fear of failure, which in a learning context is incredibly important in building student efficacy, because if you can make problem solving seem less like work, then why not, right? Although these are just a few examples, you can sort of see what a thought process is here. It's not about using games as replacements for actual teaching, but about using games as an experience to emphasize a point. And this is important because game-based learning frameworks also emphasize the necessity of teachers to contextualize gameplay experiences for any educational meaning to be retained, otherwise the meaning of the interaction goes no further than the game itself.
In trying to make games more viable, we need to rethink the relationship between games, classrooms, and teachers. So if the role of the teacher is to provide answers, contextualize content experiences, and to facilitate the creation of meaning as part of the broader process of learning, why can't it be done with games? I feel like part of the problem is that there's this perception that video games don't really work in education, which isn't particularly hard to see if you think of Phase 1 as ruining it for everyone else, like putting the miserable tropical nightmare that is pineapple on a pizza. But I think the other problem is just narrow thinking.
As technological integration and focus on student-centered learning experiences become greater factors in education systems, the viability of using games seems like something that's worth exploring. If I could say anything about Phase 1, it's that it's less the fault of the product itself and more about how it was used. Now, game-based learning with video games is not just about selecting a title, because not every title has relevant educational value. It's about being able to effectively apply and contextualize gameplay experiences that align with broader curriculum necessities. One way to make this work is not necessarily treat games as games, but to treat games as text. The proposed model for games as text involves utilizing games primarily as a simulative content tool that contextualizes curriculum content in a practical, interactive way. Traditional texts like novels, films, and even music are used extensively as learning resources to either expand the curriculum content or used as part of the assessment. Think of it like this: if the purpose of a traditional textbook is to allow teachers to facilitate analytical discussion, convey information, and enhance a learning experience to improve student efficacy through mediation, why can't it be done with video games? I want to re-emphasize that the effectiveness of a text is reliant upon the teacher's ability to align learning experiences and meanings with the existing curriculum and the assessment standards that accompany it. The main point here is to argue for the normalization of its use.
Games as text relies on three important considerations: curriculum alignment, contextualization of gameplay, and assessment relevance. So let's say I want to design humanities where I wanted to explore different government types, the relationship between civics and citizenship, the importance of sustainable government, all of which in an interactive way I could use a game like Democracy 3.
Democracy 3 is a 2013 government simulation game developed by Positech Games and involves the player managing a virtual nation as its leader. The main gameplay loop involves players introducing and altering policies that affect different government areas like taxes, foreign policy, welfare, and public services. This has to be done by creating a stable cabinet by assigning ministers to different sectors, which generates political power and different bonuses to different areas. The player uses sliders to adjust how GDP is spent in different sectors and must balance expenditure and income to pay off national debt. This is done mostly through hovering over different area bubbles to see what other factors contribute to it and allows you to make adjustments accordingly. But the game is also about managing people, as the primary goal of the game is to win the support of various factions that make up your electorate and to preserve your political power until the next election while avoiding the possibility of being assassinated. It isn't possible to please everyone because people can be in multiple factions, so the point is to be able to balance the needs of society and the people with what the government budget and ideology allows. The game also throws events like natural disasters, government scandals, and acts of terrorism at you, which not only provides variety but also showcases the effect of external forces on governments. The educational value of a game like Democracy 3 lies in its ability to act as a flexible simulation tool that emphasizes the difficulty of actually managing a government. Every imaginable aspect of society can be adjusted, from deciding to have no police force at all to seeing the effect of legalizing recreational drugs. From an educational perspective, although this may look like it has a huge learning curve, the barrier to entry for such a game is actually quite low, but more importantly, the fairly freeform nature of the game facilitates exploration and testing of how different sectors interact with each other and what would happen if I wanted to turn Australia into a socialist state. In attempting to design a unit that uses Democracy 3, you can argue for its practicality by aligning the game with curriculum standards and learning outcomes. You have to remember that since the Australian curriculum places no real limitation on what constitutes a text, if you wanted students to explore the learning strands of civics and citizenship, you could use the game for content simulation or even as part of the assessment. This hinges largely on the ability of the teacher to contextualize the content in relation to the curriculum standards.
If I had to put everything into a unit plan, it would look something like this.
This is a very brief outline, but let's assume that in a term you have 5 lessons a week for 10 weeks and are using a prescribed textbook in conjunction with the game. You could have 1 or 2 game sessions a week and would have students fill out a game journal in, say, the last 15 minutes of a lesson every session you have. Since the game is a text supplement, your non-game lessons would ideally involve completing written tasks or activities that give greater context to the game, or even vice versa. For example, you could set it up by having the first lesson be an explanation about the importance of debt management, and then have the next 2 lessons be an in-game activity based around the previous lesson's concepts. It doesn't really have to take up much time, because what you're doing with the game is using it as a textbook content simulation. You really only need a few lessons where you actually play the game. That way your future lessons are scaffolded by the gameplay experience. If you wanted to maintain game control, build assessment, or even just emphasize a point, you can set game parameters to do any or even all of this. For example, if I wanted the student to solve the debt crisis within 1 election period, or if I wanted the main goal of the session to be an attempt to try and fix the American healthcare system, the game could easily allow that. Variation is also facilitated by modifications, or mods, which are custom scenarios that can be downloaded to offer different experiences or parameters. As much as secondary education is about curriculum alignment, there is very little reason why you can't have fun with this if you can contextualize the gameplay. In debriefing or non-play lessons, you would facilitate discussion and combine the experience with several theory lessons that explain specific government features, like the role of court systems, or literally anything else that you feel wasn't really adequately covered in the game. The point of this is to not rely purely on the game, but to find balance between it and traditional frameworks, because as flexible and versatile as the game is, the teacher still needs to draw connections between the abstractions of the game and the subject matter.
I mean, if a student doesn't understand what Romeo and Juliet is saying, it's no good thinking they'll automatically understand what it's about and how hot garbage play actually is.
Although a teacher's game knowledge and skill in this is important, being able to interact and mediate the relationship between game and unit content becomes a requirement when you're looking at assessment relevance. A player can very easily have his nation fall apart due to rebellion and increasing debt, so data is important to track why things like this happen. Games like this have a huge range of metric data that allows students and teachers to analyze what went wrong, where, what could have been adjusted, and what policies have the greatest effect. This could be excellent for comparative discussion because every player would likely have a different experience, especially if the parameters facilitate exploration and relatively unrestricted play. Since the idea is to use the game as a text, you can build assessments around the in-game experiences and metric data. You could have students use their nation as a comparative sample in a research project, create running topics and essays around the experience, or even just have them deliver a presentation about why everything in the nation was on fire. Assessing evidence of learning is an exercise in integration because the game is simply another text you're using as a tool for curriculum implementation. This is just one example, but you can sort of see where I'm going with this. The point is to literally use the game as text. And I know I keep hammering on about it, but part of the problem with Phase 1 really was the lack of careful integration and curriculum alignment. The methodology of treating games as text revolves around mediating the lack of alignment by trying to make the integration of games more fluid and feel less like an artificial gimmick. Careful title selection is important here because not every game can be used educationally or can be well justified enough to warrant actual integration. For instance, games that are incredibly story heavy, have long completion times, or require too high a skill ceiling to be quickly accessible are inappropriate in this framework, not because they lack educational value, but because they simply can't be well integrated into a practical teaching framework. It becomes about retrofitting games to be fit for purpose by justifying and cannibalizing the educational value of the product and then aligning it with curriculum needs. A game like This War of Mine by 11-bit Studios is a good example of this. It's a war survival game inspired by 1992's Siege of Sarajevo and focuses on the civilian experience of war. The player controls a group of survivors whose makeshift shelter is situated in a besieged city and must not only manage things like the health and hunger of the survivors, but must also scavenge resources at night to ensure the continued survival of the group. Players can choose to trade, upgrade their shelter, or steal from others, but ultimately the goal is to survive long enough for a ceasefire to be declared in the city. The game is depressing, and that's kind of the point. It focuses on the human condition in times of war and creates a narrative that pits morality against necessity. You are constantly building a narrative experience based on your own choices and interactions with the world. Do I steal this medicine from this old lady with dementia to ensure that my friend survives? Do I break into the house of a couple I know is just trying to survive like me? Do I kill a person to ensure my group has food? These are the kind of choices that players are constantly encountering in the game. In implementing a game like this, you could compare the gameplay experience with that of other texts-like novels, for instance, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and facilitate character analysis, themes, and motifs between the two. The purpose of the game here would be to act as a simulation of the human condition under such stress, which then could be used as part of assessment that involved analyzing and interpreting player actions, events, and motivations in either formal or creative formats. While in something more upbeat, you could use Besieged, a physics-based creation game created by Spyling Studios, and it's pretty much as described. It's a game that involves players building war machines using a collection of mechanical parts to either complete various in-game goals or just to experiment with. The game is fairly versatile when it comes to approach, because you can approach a problem in the most efficient way possible or just create something completely and monstrously fun. The viability of this in a science classroom should be immediately obvious if you've been following along. Your assessments can be built around parameters you've set in-game, like having only a certain amount of parts to work with. Projects can be built around having students write hypotheses and testing it in-game, or you can even just use it to allow students to explain things like locomotion.
It's a bit like building these robot things, where you can build it any way you like, but you have to explain how and why it moves.
I've tried to give as broad a range of examples as possible, but hopefully you sort of see where I'm going with this. Education systems as a whole don't really assess the process by which students actually learn, so if you can allow agency and control to be a more dynamic factor in the process of education, you can make learning less about what to learn and more about how to learn. Games as text is a method of facilitating this because it treats games as part of the learning cycle. Traditional text can engage and teach us, but only games allow us to do so interactively, and that by itself has value and should ideally be something education systems want to harness. It's important to acknowledge here that not all students will find video games an appealing learning medium. Some may find novels and films more engaging teaching by comparison. But the same could be said of the reverse, and that's sort of the beauty of having multiple learning styles. Games as text as a methodology can be thought of as a kind of differentiation that offers an alternative route for meeting learner outcomes. You don't need video games to be the sole assessment source, you can easily combine it with other texts, but if it exists as an additional and well-designed learning pathway, omitting it sort of defeats the purpose of having differentiation at all.
I think what bothers me the most is that few systems actually even consider using video games at all, and I understand there are barriers, but it just feels like we're missing out, like me and NBN.
Like I've been saying, using video games as part of the education process is not a foolproof system. There are barriers to effective implementation, much of which is funding and time related. Integrating games into a school curriculum is dependent on not only the availability of hardware and software resources, but also administrative and community support. The lack of funding and resource support can be attributed to skepticism towards integrating video games into education systems. And while I still think that it's just narrow perception, the idea of using something that is designed for entertainment educationally can be considered understandably haphazard at best and detrimental at worst. But it's not just a resource investment, it's a time investment as well. It's very difficult to convince someone that something like this is worth trying when most curriculum outlines are fairly rigid, especially in a system where video games are, pretty much extinct.
And that's sort of why we need good models of integration and a willingness to try something different, because otherwise technological integration becomes nothing more than a huge waste of time and resources, like the Hobbit movies or trying to make coriander not disgusting.
But despite all of these problems, the one factor that will make the process more viable is the role of the teacher. Aside from teacher ability and their game literacy, a willingness to explore and remain diligently open-minded is something that's always needed. So by now you can probably tell that I love games. I believe they are capable of giving us meaningful experiences and can teach us something about the world and ourselves. But whether or not these experiences and meanings are educationally relevant is dependent on the teacher's ability to contextualize everything and bring it back to a broader educational point. Oversight and nurturing the transference value of play is important here, because by failing to contextualize, the game becomes, well, simply a game, and something without educational value can't effectively exist in an education system. Being able to remediate and maintain this is, amongst everything else, the funding, the time management, the societal and individual perception of games, the greatest challenge to video game integration. Video games engage and mesmerize us in a way that other mediums just can't. Games have the ability to allow us to imagine and think aloud, cry and laugh, explore and discover, experience thousands of different narratives, live as different characters, and see things that we can't possibly believe exist in what is essentially ones and zeros, all of this in an interactive way. And that has more value than I think most people realize. The distinct lack of video games in education represents a missed opportunity to utilize something that can make the experience of learning even more engaging and more enjoyable. I focus quite a bit on the history of edutainment and early integration, not purely to admonish the failure and disappointment of Phase 1 integration, but to create a sense of progression. I feel that you only really know where you're going if you know where you've come from, and in trying to improve the quality of education in a world that's so integrated, not attempting to even explore the possibility of alternative methodologies relegates us to an anachronistic state of conservatism. Education and society is a relationship that's cyclical, but this ostensible lack of willingness to explore, at worst, renders technological integration a pointless exercise. I think that viewing games as text can work, but it's a process that can't be fleshed out quickly. It needs implementation, it needs testing, but more importantly, it needs not only the support of the education system as a whole, but a collective willingness to explore and seek educational improvement through technology. And I think maybe it's just a matter of time. As video games become more popular and integrated into our societies and cultures, support for using them as educational tools may become more well received. And I feel that signs of this are already showing. Minecraft's educational potential has been ceaselessly referenced, brain trainers and on-the-go learning programs flood our app stores, and we're slowly seeing more and more companies designing research-based educational games. I think we're getting there, and regardless of whether or not tech integration into education turns out to be effective, there is very little reason not to continue designing and exploring ways to improve it.
I want to end here by saying that technology probably won't solve all of education's problems, but the development of education is as much a systemic exploration as it is a social process, and a cursory glance at what is achievable with game technology can inspire a world of possibility.